Hi, everybody. Ian Bremmer here. Got your world in more than 60 seconds. As long as we're in crisis mode, I'm doing more seconds. It's the least I can do, right? And I have your questions right here, opened up and ready to go. First, who is Lebanon's new prime minister? His name is Mustafa Adib, and I had never heard of him. Apparently, he wasn't being considered for prime minister until apparently 24 hours ago. He was Lebanon's ambassador to Germany, or is Lebanon's ambassador to Germany, and also a PhD in political science. So clearly we must like him. He can't be a bad guy. It looks basically like a technocrat. But in part, it's because Lebanon is impossible to govern and can't agree on any of the well-known and outspoken figures. And this is a massive economic challenge that they're facing. Their currency is falling apart. Their budgets they can't fund. They had that massive explosion that's going to cost billions to rebuild Beirut. Just happened a couple weeks ago. They're also fighting coronavirus. They have millions of refugees on their territory that they're paying for. And they don't have as much money from the Gulf states that they had historically because they're facing their own budgetary challenges. On top of which, it's really hard to get an IMF deal done when you don't have effective governance and when Hezbollah is part of your government structure. So it's pretty ugly. I wish this guy well. I can't imagine we're going to be hearing from him for very long, but that is the situation in Lebanon. Godspeed. With daily COVID cases surging to record highs, why is India reopening? Well, a couple of reasons. First, because it's a very poor country. And people are getting tired and angry of a pretty significant and severe lockdown that Prime Minister Modi had originally put in place. Also, India is a relatively young country. And so even if they have lots of cases, not as many people are going to need hospitalization. And mortality rates are comparatively much lower than they are in the United States or Western Europe. That matters. Also, you have so many people that are prepared to live with a threat of disease, whether it's coronavirus or others, if that means that they can work and they can continue to provide for their families, because the alternative with so many people at subsistence living is much worse. That's particularly true when you're not even testing many people, so you don't really understand the broad contours of the crisis. There were some recent tests in this one slum that's the largest in Mumbai. Over 1 million people live in it. I've not gone into it, but I've driven right by it on many occasions. And that 50% of that population was shown to have some kind of antibodies for coronavirus. Just ripping through that area, and yet you didn't see big demonstrations or riots about coronavirus, where you will if the lockdowns last for longer. It's a lot easier to engage in longer lockdown and longer quarantine in countries with a lot of money and the ability to provide continued support for their populations, like in Europe, like at least until now, the United States, though we'll see what happens with the phase 4 stimulus deal. In the U.S., it's getting a lot tougher for a lot of people, too. What's the update on Belarus? Will Lukashenko fall? It's looking less likely. The demonstrators, nonviolent, completely nonviolent, and in some cases, hundreds of thousands, certainly in most cases, tens of thousands on the streets for a few weeks solid now in Minsk and in some other places. But Lukashenko, the president, the dictator who stole this election, claiming 80% of the popular vote, he clearly got nowhere close to that, is now detaining and arresting journalists. He has taken away the accreditation of all of the local journalists for Western institutions. So we're not getting the same news on the ground that we were just a couple of days ago. They've also brought in special forces and they brought in tanks into Minsk, certainly sending a very disturbing message. All of that happening on the back of President Putin of Russia saying that if certain red lines were crossed, that the Russians would come in and provide direct support for Lukashenko. Putin had been staying on the sidelines for weeks. He certainly does not want to engage militarily. That will undermine popularity for Russia in Belarus. But he's now providing nearly a blank check for Lukashenko. And at the end of the day, you have to believe that that makes it much less likely that the supporters of democracy on the streets in Belarus are going to succeed. Horrible to say that, horrible to see this, but that is what it looks like right now. Certainly personally, continuing to stand for those demonstrators and hope that they can persist and prevail. But my God, very dangerous and very courageous. If I had a kid right now in Belarus, I wouldn't want him or her to be out there on the streets. And that's what you also have to watch out for, right? I mean, the human dimension here, it's very easy to say stand for them. But in many of the industries, for example, in Belarus, you had seen demonstrations, but they're not willing to risk their jobs because otherwise, how are they going to make a living? And so they haven't persisted with the kind of grass movement action in shutting down the strike action and shutting down those places that you've seen among the population as a whole in Minsk. It does look like it's moving towards Lukashenko and towards state power. Finally, what do I make of recent far-right protests in Germany? Well, even in Germany, where they've done an awful lot to provide support for the middle and working class and to ensure that people continue to have the ability to take care of themselves, to meet their bills, to not get evicted from their apartments, all of that. There is a significant level of impatience with very tough lockdowns and shutdowns across Germany. There's been very wide support for Merkel. There's been a federal system in Germany, but much better alignment among the federal leaders, the regional leaders in Germany than you've seen among red and blue states in the United States, for example. Merkel's popularity remains very high consistently through the pandemic, but you also saw thousands of the far right actually demonstrating in Berlin, opposed to social distancing, opposed to mandatory lockdowns. It is a tiny percentage of the population compared to those sorts of sentiments in other parts of Europe and certainly in the United States, but something to watch out for, particularly something to watch out for in former Eastern Germany, where that political sentiment is by far the strongest, but also a part that's done comparatively well given the social and economic response of the German government since coronavirus has hit. So I wouldn't worry too much about that, but clearly something that's worth the headlines, especially as the U.S. Continues to be dominated by Trump, dominated by social, racial instability, and of course our own pandemic. So important to be looking at the news happening around the world today, especially because this pandemic is truly global and is affecting all of us together. So that's it for me. I'll see you all again next week. Be good.